What does it mean to grow beyond grades? What works about standards-based grading and where does it fall short? How can we de-emphasize grades and shift the focus to growth in our practice? Welcome back to another episode of the Teachers on Fire podcast, airing live on YouTube every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. My name is Tim Cavey, and my mission here is to warm your heart, spark your thinking, and ignite your professional practice. Today's teacher on fire is Arthur Chiaravalli. In his teaching career, Arthur has taught mathematics, language arts, media arts, and technology. He has a passion for helping teachers move toward more humane, effective approaches to assessment, feedback, and reporting that help students develop positive belief in their abilities. He is also the founder of Grow Beyond Grades, a global group of educators convinced that teaching and learning is better when we grade less. Connect with him on LinkedIn simply by entering his name, searching his name, on X at I am Chiaravalli, and on the web at growbeyondgrades.org. All right, well, Arthur, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today. Are you, my friend, ready to light it up?
I'm so fired up, Tim. I've been up since 5 o'clock this morning. I'm just excited about this interview. I'm a longtime admirer of your work, and I'm just so excited to be on your podcast today. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, it is a pleasure. I can say the same, Arthur. I've been a long distance admirer as well. And so it's so fun for me to chat with you in real time this morning. We're coming almost coast to coast here, quite a distance apart, but the miracle of technology is allowing us to have this conversation in real time and get into one of my favorite topics, which is assessment. So I can't wait to hear about some of your ideas and values and beliefs that you advocate for. Before we get there, though, I want to dig into your story. So would you share with us about a low moment or an experience of adversity that you've had somewhere on your personal or professional journey, and tell us how you overcame it?
Okay. So many to choose from, low points in this profession of teaching, but we love it and we keep coming back to it for some reason. But I think mine was unfolding over a period of time. I was about 15 years into my career. I was beginning to kind of feel myself moving toward burnout. I was primarily an English language arts teacher at the time. And I think if I could put my finger on a moment, after 15 years, I was finally going to NCTE for the first time, National Council of Teachers of English, in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was presenting on a totally other topic, not assessment, but on another topic with some of my colleagues at Michigan State College of Education. And I got there, arrived, checked into the hotel room, went up to my hotel room. I got the conference handbook on my bed. I'm looking out over the city. I've never been to Atlanta, Georgia before. And I'm thinking about these reams of papers that I have in my attaché. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this has been building up over the last couple of weeks. And rookie mistake, I'd collected them all at the same time, which I know teachers have experience with that, where you kind of get the timing off, collect a bunch of papers, and now you're buried in papers. And I'm saying to myself, okay, I'm going to have to miss a lot of this conference. I mean, I just arrived and I'm saying I'm going to have to miss a bunch of this conference. And I'm almost getting to this mindset of like a person in the throes of addiction where I'm saying, I wonder if my colleagues will notice, that I haven't seen me in the hallways. They haven't seen me at lunch. They haven't seen me at any of the sessions. I'm back in my hotel room grading, and I blocked off all this time for grading. And then I'm actually beginning my process. So my process actually begins at that time, stapling rubrics to the back of all the papers that I'm going to be grading. It's just this mindless work. And I'm about a quarter of the way through. And I'm really thinking like, I'm not going to be able to make it to anything except my session at the very end. And at that moment, I'm just like, no. I had a moment of clarity and I'm just like, I am not doing this. I'm not doing this now, and I'm not doing this in the future. And that was actually the moment that I began getting out of that low point. I mean, immediately. And I went to the conference and I participated in the conference and I put some things in place after the conference that allowed me to deal with that in a gradeless way. But I will get into that a little bit later. But that was kind of the low point, and then it turned into this kind of transformational moment for me.
Sometimes I've heard Dave Ramsey use the expression, you've got to be sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you certainly hit that point. You hit that no point. And I love how you articulated the quiet desperation that so many educators have experienced, where there's got to be, you just have this thought that there's got to be more to teaching in life than this. And I'm so glad you hit that, because it pushed you into this completely transformative way of thinking about learning and grades. So let's go there next, Arthur. Let's start with standards-based grading. And I'm not sure how much we need to set this up. I hope most of my listeners and viewers have a good sense of what standards-based grading is all about. What do you like about SBG, and where does it fall short in your view?
I mean, this SPG has been a big part of my story. I encountered SPG very early on in my career, and I actually am very grateful for that fact. So just probably 2-3 years into my career, I encountered the work of Ken O'Connor in particular, 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, How to Grade for Learning. And I had an opportunity to see him as a young teacher share those 15 fixes for broken grades. Our district brought him in. And I think I was teaching at alternative high school at the time, and it occurred to me, I mean, this is just sort of mind blown, this experience of hearing Ken O'Connor talk. It occurred to me that when I gave a student a bad grade, whether on an individual assignment or just overall, like they flunked my class or whatever, it was less a reflection of whether or not they could learn the skills and concepts that I was teaching them, and more a reflection of their lives. They were struggling with housing insecurity or food insecurity. And we had an on-site daycare. So many of them were either having children or had children. And so there was all this turbulence in their life. And I couldn't, in good conscience, tell myself that these kids were getting the same opportunity to succeed as the ones who didn't have any of those obstacles. So standards-based grading, I won't go into all the different practices, but a lot of it just opened up my eyes to what equitable, humane, and in fact, accurate grading can look like. And I think I got a lot of mileage out of that. As I went on in my career, and in particular, as I transitioned back to being a full-time English language arts teacher, I was also teaching math at different points during my career, technology, media arts. But English language arts teachers, I don't mind saying, we have it probably the hardest of anyone in the school. We have papers. And the problem with standards-based grading is not only do you need to grade it, assess it and grade it once, you have to provide that opportunity. So core to standards-based grading is this idea that you should be able to reassess and redo whenever, to a large extent. And so I came up with a lot of different ways of structuring that. So it wasn't just sort of capricious, yeah, I'm going to turn this back in again. It was like, yes, do some work on this and really, respond to feedback. You can certainly resubmit that. But I mean, it took all that work that I was doing just normally as an English language arts teacher, and it doubled or tripled it. And that's kind of the teacher side of things. The student side of things was whenever I would give that work back to students, they would just flip to the back, look at the rubric, and then they would not pay attention to my feedback at all. And so I noticed and I intuited, even before I saw the research on any of this, that when you put a score on something, it overrides any kind of comments that you would have given that student. And you have one of two things happening. You have students becoming discouraged. You have students who are becoming complacent. And there are students who have either maxed out your scale or maxed out your rubric. And where do you go? There's nothing else to say. You got a 4 point again, And so it's like, what are we even doing here? So those are I think some of the drawbacks and the ways that standards-based grading started to fall short for me. And then of course, the story where I actually had a turning point.
So interesting, and I want to touch on some of those points, but I also have some important questions on the way. So I need to bite my tongue a little bit here. I do want to say hello to Brian Arnott. Good morning from
Morning,
Northern
Brian.
Washington. Or I'm assuming Northern, that may not, it may be Southern
I
Washington.
want
Good morning to
to
you, Brian. Thanks for tuning in on YouTube.
I want to hear you pronounce that one right there. Pronounce that town.
I know you noticed I skipped over it. Snoqualmie? I'm not sure. And we've got Brother Phil here on LinkedIn, not an educator, but a lifelong learner. It says, those "I shouldn't be doing this" moments can cause us to lead to resentment or frustration, and we can let those realizations create determination toward healthy change. Absolutely. Yes.
I love that.
Sometimes we just have to, again, hit that bottom point where we say, no more of this. Something's got to be different. So I'd love to come back to standards-based grading. I hope we can, but I also want to talk about another term that we hear a lot from you and some of your colleagues, and that is gradeless. And I know it appears as one word and two words, right? So when we talk about gradeless, how do you define it, and how does it differ from standards-based grading? How is it a different idea?
I think a lot of us, at least at the K-12 level, we came out of standards-based grading. But our definition of gradeless, we basically have two definitions, and there's kind of a continuum between the two definitions. So firstly, gradeless can mean grading less. And by that, we mean limiting the impact of grades within whatever the current constraints are. Maybe you have to give grades. But these teachers avoid harmful practices, some of the toxic practices that are associated with grading. So no opportunity to redo, zeros on the indefensible, mathematically disproportionate 100-point scale. Don't know who set that up, but it's like, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it just kills kids when they get a zero on the 100-point scale. Gradeless can also mean without grades. That is, avoiding the damaging and demotivating effects of grades entirely. You can do that over the course of the entire marking period, where you don't put a grade on anything. You're just involved in feedback and in reflection and in peer assessment and self-assessment. And then many of us have a conference where we involve the student in deciding what is that grade that ultimately gets reported out. And we have some ways of doing that so that there's a modicum of fairness that goes along with that. But there are also institutions, and this is kind of a growing phenomenon, where there are schools that have replaced traditional report cards altogether, and they use portfolios and descriptive evaluations instead. So there's that as well, where we have an entirely gradeless experience.
So I want to talk about your experience, and my next question might be a little bit off track, so you can correct me. I understand that you do gradeless, I'm using two words there, inside of a grading context. So you're making the choice to grade fewer things and focus more on feedback, if I have that correct. So tell us what prompted you to first make this move, and what did your first steps look like? I'm thinking of those listeners, Arthur, who are perhaps like you in an environment where they are required to produce grades and averages. I am not in my context, but I know many are. And so the idea of dropping some of those grades or giving grades out fewer times might be intimidating, might be a little scary. What did that look like for you? What were your first steps like?
Yeah, I think it started in that hotel room in Atlanta, Georgia. And I think the method that I used for that particular batch of papers was a method that came to me from Todd Finley, an educator, and I believe he's now teaching at Eastern Carolina University, called Letter to Class, where it's a collective form of feedback. And so basically what I did was, over the course of that weekend, I looked at about a quarter of the papers that I had to grade, and I had two columns of strengths and weaknesses. And I think all of us know that we get about a quarter of the way in, we know what the strengths and weaknesses are. You don't have to read the whole stack. The problem is that you have all those empty boxes in your grade book that need to be filled up. So in terms of providing feedback, if I'm just thinking about providing feedback, I really only need to read about a quarter of those papers in order to find out what are the common strengths and what are some of the common misunderstandings that we need to address in class. So I was able to do that. I was able to get that back to them when I came back on Monday. And, I read over the letter, I had it projected up on the screen, and the students got to work. I mean, when they heard that, I asked them to examine their work for some of the strengths and weaknesses that I had provided and to make some goals for the next time that we would be doing this task. That's one of the advantages of English language arts is that it's recursive. We are probably going to be circling back to a similar task. No need to redo at this point. Probably going to come back to something like this. So that was one of the things that I put in place. Collective feedback, I think, is a big piece of it. One of the other things that I put in place were portfolios. So at the time, I just did a basic one. I think it was Google Sheets or something like that. It wasn't very fancy, but I created kind of these portfolios that students could curate their work and their reflections on their work so that we could bring those to the grade conference at the end. Ultimately, I ended up going with Seesaw portfolio platform. And that was really cool because they could kind of folder it, and they could folder it in multiple different folders by standard. And so if we were looking at, say, a reading standard and how did you do on that? Did you show some learning and growth in that? We could go to that folder and we could have that conversation. In terms of getting the grade book to not look crazy, because I did have to have a conversation ultimately with my principal, who kind of caught me in the hallway and said, "Why are there no grades in your grade book?" I had to kind of build some things. And I think the short answer is all this is situated. You have to be aware of your community and your institution, and you need to interface with that in different ways. And I could probably coach anyone who's watching us right now as to things that you can do Monday within your setting. But there's just so many different situations right now. Right now, I am in Vermont, where standards-based grading is the law of the land, probably similar to you in BC, and I think maybe Canada more broadly. I'm an administrator now. I have a different way of approaching this. We can talk about that a little bit later. But those are some of the things that I put in place at first.
I love that. And I think for a lot of educators that are coming from more of a traditional paradigm, we need to think about the purpose. It goes back to the purpose of assessment. So where in that hotel room, it might have taken you 10 minutes to give one student a carefully calculated percentage or letter grade. What's going to move their learning forward is maybe a question that we need to think about. So if the purpose of assessment is moving learning forward, giving that student 2 or 3, I know you talked about collective feedback, but even giving them just 2 or 3 ways to improve their writing, probably much more helpful than giving them a carefully calculated letter grade and percentage. And so I think when teachers start to think about that, and I know sometimes we're limited by the system, you just talked about that, but right. When we see assessment not as a wages paradigm where we need to pay students for their work, but where we're actually trying to situate them in their learning journey, it completely flips the paradigm, and we can start to look at assessment a lot differently. Thanks for joining us, Teachers on Fire. If you're getting value from this conversation, give this video a like. I need to take a moment to address my listeners and viewers here. So last week I did have a couple of guests lined up who are very anxious to come onto the program, but unfortunately the timing of last week's engagement didn't really work for one of them, and so they decided to bow out. And that was fine for me because I was on the Atlantic coast at a conference there, 4 time zones removed from my normal home, and I was, of course, in a hotel, so that was fine to take a week off. And then this week I've actually completed a personal move, which is why, if you are watching the video, you can see a bunch of boxes behind me. The new Teachers on Fire studio is in transition, so we'll see where that goes in the coming weeks. Maybe you'll see a bit of an evolution in my background, but yeah, it's been quite a ride. Brian's back, and he says, I like the framing of collected feedback. Yes, collected and collective. I wonder if Brian's talking about here. I have done similar things when going over a formative math assessment. Yes, just telling the class, like, hey, here are 3 things that you're doing really well. Here are 2 things that I'd like you to work on. That can be really valuable. And think about the time savings for the teacher. Let's keep going, Arthur. What are some of the benefits that you've seen and experienced by de-emphasizing grades in your gradebook? So maybe leaving some of those cells empty, as we talked about. And oh yes, I did want to touch on zeros, which you sort of mentioned in passing. But what are some of the benefits that you've seen and experienced from de-emphasizing grades and shifting the focus to growth in your students?
Yeah, I think it just takes anxiety, all the anxiety and all the sort of fraught relationship between teachers and students. I mean, it's happening now, right now, toward the end of September. Students are getting that first major, maybe summative grade back.
Right.
And it's like the honeymoon is over,
Yeah.
essentially. I mean, the minute that happens, and they're flipping to the back, as I said, there's this nice, like, sort of dialogue that the teacher tries to create with feedback, but it's just flip right back to the back, and there's the grade. And, so it's like the anxiety is off the table. The fraught relationship is no longer there. And we're having conversations as human beings. Now, the grade may be looming, and I have to acknowledge that even with our grading conferences that are happening much later, and students who are really focused on grade may be feeling a little bit even more anxious as a result of this. But you get into it, and it's like we're still engaged. There's not that drop off of engagement. And I say that for the students who are struggling and the students who ace it. They could ace it a year ago. There's a drop off of engagement the minute that the grade hits their desk, because they're either becoming discouraged or they're becoming complacent. And the conversation stopped. Something about the letter grade causes the conversation to stop. And so we're able to engage in these deeper conversations. Those students on the quote unquote lower end of it have an opportunity to move forward. They have the feedback that they need to succeed, and they're not getting discouraged by this letter grade that is going to be going into the grade book, and it's looking bad to mom and dad. It's like we're having a conversation here. We're not where we need to be, but we can get there. And there's something about that grade, even if it's going in formative spot, it is still registering with both the student and the family. And it makes it summative feeling. It makes it feel higher stakes than it really is. And in my own setting right now, I've seen teachers who use standards-based grading with fidelity. And it's like, you should be getting a 2.5 at the beginning of the year. You should be. And yet it's like kids are freaking out and asking for a 504 or an IEP or whatever in the United States, asking for a plan because they think that they're struggling. You're not struggling, you're learning. This is productive struggle right now. And so that's one of the biggest benefits is that we can have that conversation. Now, the other thing, as far as English language arts go, and I would say this to probably everyone who's listening right now, we love our subject areas. I love reading. I love writing. I love all the language arts. And yet the part of it that's measurable is this thin sliver. And it's probably the most meaningless sliver of what it is to write well and read well. Those are the measurable things. If I want to open it up and have this conversation about what does good writing look like? What does strong reading, engaged reading look like? I can't limit myself to that tiny sliver. I can't limit myself to what fits in boxes on a rubric.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like I got my passion back,
Mm-hmm.
my passion for literature, my passion for the English language arts.
Arthur, I'm going to go slightly off script here. I'm thinking about increasing that student agency, because a couple of times you've talked about that student who just looks right at the back and tunes out. They're not really engaged. They're not owning their learning journey. They're just simply striving for the wage, as I like to call it, at the end. So talk about the role of self-assessment, peer assessment, co-created criteria. How can these things increase student agency, and how have they shown up in your practice? Or are you still, I know it sounds like you're out of the classroom at this point, but how do you see those things improving the engagement?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. How can we involve students? I mean, that's really the
Right.
bottom line. I mean, every
Yeah.
step of this in terms of communicating expectations, that's sort of the front end of things. Helping students to maybe meet those expectations once they've been communicated, and then communicating what's happening with learning and growth on the back end of things, so that everyone involved and people who have a right to know have a clear picture of what's happening. I think I've these things were shifting I think probably even before I went gradeless. But one of the things that I noticed as I got away from that rubric of what good looks like in reading, what good looks like in writing, what good looks like in the other language arts, I started feeling comfortable inviting students into that conversation and having exemplars, in some cases, my own exemplar. As years went on, student exemplars, who students have done a really good job. In some cases, like actual writers out there in the world. What do they do? Why was that so successful? Why was that intro or that opener so catchy? And not saying like, here's a list of openers that you can use, to like grab it, and everyone does like a question, or everyone does a quote, but it's just like, what is it? And the cool thing about that conversation is that that's an actual meaningful conversation. I have learned more about what works in writing as a result of being able to engage my students in that question. And I do it also with discussions. I'll bring a discussion from a past year. I record them all, and we'll play it up there. And it was a really good discussion. And it's like, what was so good about that conversation? Why was it firing on all cylinders at all times? What were the moves that different participants were making, in terms of, the content they were sharing, in terms of the active listening they were giving, in terms of the responses and references to texts that they were doing? What was so good? And then to be able to like list those off, and then maybe go into that discussion with two or three of them. It's not like everyone look at your rubric, which just gives you the whole universe of everything that I think is supposed to show up in whatever this assessment is. It's like, let's take two or three things, and then let's reflect on those things afterward. And at every stage in that process, there's an invitation to the student to engage with this and for them to find meaning in it. And I think there's a larger question in what you asked about, like, how can we actually engage them in what do you want to pursue? What are you passionate about? What's most meaningful to you? And let's actually go down that pathway, not necessarily the learning trajectory that yours truly has pre-packaged for you.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of a larger question too.
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking about inquiry, but you're right. That's another way to engage students in the process. No, I asked the question because I'm continually reminded and struck by the fact that I need to be giving my own students, and sadly, I don't teach English right now, but I do teach ADST, or Applied Design Skills and Technology, to elementary students. And why am I not having them assess or self-assess their work on almost everything they do? And
Right.
I know students sometimes moan and groan about, another assessment or another self-reflection or something. But I mean, the engagement that comes out of that is always, always so rich. And the conversations you just described are incredible. When students, once again, are thinking about deeply thinking about the standards and thinking about what good writing, what powerful writing looks like, and comparing those standards against their own practice, against their own work. Adrian is here on LinkedIn. Welcome, Adrian. He says these conversations are part of a shift in mindset, especially for students. Absolutely. Yes. Jay Blair is on YouTube. Welcome, Jay Blair. He says, yes, grading will always be an uphill struggle until we help students find meaning and purpose in their learning. Exactly. Why are we doing this right now, right? And he continues on, I also think students respond more when we explore the interconnectedness of learning. They know life is not siloed or compartmentalized so they appreciate learning more when we pull back that curtain. Well said, sir. And Adrian again on LinkedIn says learning goes deeper when we move away from rubrics and grades and move towards conversations about the craft of writing. Back to conversations, right? Which are the heart of learning, and they're the heart of behavior too, which is a whole other conversation, but you can't go wrong with simply engaging with kids. Arthur, what is one of your greatest laments about traditional grading practices and paradigms that you see in our schools today? I'm sure there's a list there, but what's near the top of your list?
I think I've enumerated a lot of them already.
Sure.
I think the biggest one, and the one that actually had me leave the profession, was the amount of work that you do in grading. And that has not gotten better. In many ways, it's gotten worse with standards-based grading. As much as I love standards-based grading and all the authors and consultants that have taught me so much in that regard, it's just exhausting, back-breaking work, and it takes the fun out of reading student work and watching them grow as readers and writers. In my case, I think that's the big one. That's the real big one for me. And then on the student side is just that they end up chasing points. They end up chasing numbers and letters, and then they have a quarter life crisis because they have no idea what they're passionate about. They've never chased that. They've never written anything except for a rubric. And so they have not wrestled with that. And I remember, I think one of the comments is that it is a struggle. We have monopolized assessment, grading, and reporting to the extent that students are just totally in a state of passivity about this. And you will get a question if you decide to go gradeless from your students at some point where they say, "Isn't this your job?" And it's like, no, it's your job. If you can't tell the story of your learning and growth, if you can't discover that, curate that, reflect on that, and communicate that, no one else is going to do it for you. And grades, by the way, are meaningless now. Each passing year, they become more and more meaningless. I mean, it's almost like a culture war topic now, where it's like grade inflation, all this stuff, and kind of hearkening back to this time when grades actually meant something. No, grades have never been able to tell that story.
Powerful stuff. I want to just come back to something you said, that SBG can increase the workload for teachers, and even I think you said backbreaking, to the extent that it's backbreaking. So when I think about standards-based grading, I think about, let's take a traditional essay, and instead of reviewing that essay for 20 different elements of style and structure and meaning and so forth, now I'm just looking for one particular set of evidence, one piece of evidence against one learning target. I'm narrowing my focus, and to me, it makes the process lighter. Are you just pointing to the idea of multiple iterations of work, and this idea that teachers are reviewing the same student's work 3 or 4 times? Or is that kind of what you're thinking about when you say that standards-based grading can increase workload?
That's part of it. Absolutely. Okay. That's part of it. There's another part of it too, and you've probably experienced this as well. We know that, if you followed standards-based grading, basically standard-based grading advocates don't claim that grading needs to be objective. They claim that grading needs to be defensible. But it's that defensible part that takes so much time. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but as you're grading a student's work, you are literally slowing down, and you're pulling punches, and you're deciding how I'm going to build this argument, because I know there's going to be some pushback about this grade that I gave. I don't know if you've had that experience, but I definitely in the moment have noticed myself slowing down in the feedback that I would provide, because I'm thinking about that aspect of it. Because the conversation around grades is so fraught that I'm preparing myself to have that conversation and to be able to defend it against the student, against, possibly some caregivers, against possibly some administrator who's going to come down and say your grades are way lower than your colleagues or whatever else might happen. I'm thinking about that all the time. And one of the things that I noticed actually with Seesaw is I would do audio feedback. I'm literally like walking around my backyard, like looking at someone's work. And I have 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes. And it was a great discipline for me where it was like, I just need to say what my experience as reader of this paper was, and to give them a couple takeaways rather than trying to have an ironclad case for when I go back and I pass that back and I know that there's an argument coming. So it's that whole contentious thing that I think, it wears at you on some level, but it also adds time, I think, to the assessment process. But I think the method that you mentioned is actually a very good one, that if you can't go entirely gradeless, certainly grading less and focusing on a smaller number of things is a really smart move to make.
That's really helpful for me. Thank you. And I think there's probably a few reasons why I can't relate personally in my practice with the high stakes defense that I'm having to prepare. And maybe part of that is elementary, secondary, but it's also other systems where perhaps there's more state testing and the stakes are a little higher. Fortunately for me, that's not really a pressure that I feel is any sort of great anxiety over defending my assessment with students or parents. But
I think it's something that happens definitely in high school and at the college level.
Yes, especially when we get into those grading levels where college entrance is greatly dependent and every grade is scrutinized. So I hear you on that. Brian says percent scale is brutal to grading, and Adrian, still on LinkedIn, says truth feedback shouldn't be defensible. Feedback should be dialectic. Yes, great contrast there. So let's talk about your work, Arthur. You've done so much and continue to do so much. How and why did Teachers Going Gradeless, TG2, become Grow Beyond Grades? And just quickly, I'll say we've had Aaron Blackwelder here on the Teachers on Fire podcast, and I think other colleagues, David Frangiosa and others as well. So great memories of Teachers Going Gradeless. I think you said earlier it still continues its work. I'm not sure. So bring us up to speed on this transition.
Yeah, I think we still use the word gradeless and ungrading. I think the move to grow beyond grades, it was kind of a progression. First of all, it was our tagline, if you remember, with Teachers Going Gradeless. So, it was pretty easy to just kind of move it into the title of the organization. But I feel like it's a lot of the ungrading and gradeless, the emphasis is on the negative of the removal or the elimination of something. And it's not to say that we don't have that, but it's just that the irony is that grades have imposed the regime of less. We are the ones who want more. And so it's ironic that we're in this position where it's like, we got to get rid of grades, but it's like, grades have gotten rid of everything that we love about teaching and learning. So moving to this idea of grow beyond grades, it's a more positive articulation of what it is we do. I think it's a more accurate representation of what we do. I think the other thing is, as I get into this new setting in Vermont where we have standards-based grading, it's not going anywhere soon. How can we take the focus off that sort of grade orientation and move toward a learning orientation? Even if grades are going to hang around, they're meaningless. They don't have the meaning that they purport to have at the very least. And yet, maybe they can hang around in a vestigial way if we're able to kind of build up this idea of what is your learning story? I want to hear that. I want you to tell me, I want you to start that dialogue, and I'm going to help you along that path.
Beautifully put. There were another couple of mic drops there, Arthur. So thank you so much for that. I love that positive shift for sure in the brand, and it makes so much sense. I also understand that you have a book in the works, which is super exciting. What can you tell us about it, and when can we expect to see it land?
Oh my gosh. With my large family, everything moves at a glacial pace. I have 8 children. 2 are out of the house now, but I got to get this book going because I have to start paying for their college soon.
Yeah.
So it's got to happen soon. But I'm really hopeful that we can get it out possibly in 2025. We have a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about this. We've, of course, had a lot of contributors over the years since 2017 when we started. We are going to have some totally new and totally revised pieces that are going to go into this, but we're going to have a lot of the same practitioners that we've had in the past. What I'm really excited about, first of all, I think some of the other books that have come out on the topic, are really that sort of negative title, at least. I feel that this fills a much needed niche of like, what are we expressing positively about this move? The other thing that I really want to focus on is centering practitioner voices. I think the previous wave of gradeless reform, and I love them, the SBG folks, is almost entirely headed up by people who haven't set a foot in a classroom in years, if not decades. And that's not a luxury many of our teachers have had. But I also feel that it's the unique strength of a book that I'd like to pull together, that this group of contributors are in it. Yeah.
Super exciting, and look forward to seeing that show up in my Amazon notifications or on bookshelves near me. What's next for you, Arthur, and the Grow Beyond Grades team? Tell us about your mission, your ultimate vision, and your ongoing work, which I understand includes a conversation this weekend.
Yes, we're getting our podcast, which is nowhere near as frequent as yours, back up and running again. David Frangioso is going to be interviewing Akil Bello, who is that testing expert, and talks about equitable assessment and kind of the college admission process. So you can check that out on Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Basically on every single platform we have, including our website, growbeyondgrades.org. We are becoming, there it is. Yeah, you can go directly there, and then you can go to the various places, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., and watch it there and contribute, just like you are here. So I'm kind of taking a little bit page out of your page book or playbook there.
Love it.
And a big admirer of this podcast. We've become a nonprofit. We're a nonprofit now. I don't know exactly what that means, but we are one. So we're a 501c3, both of those in parentheses for some reason. And so we just got our letter saying that we are indeed a nonprofit. And it's part of our mission of helping teachers move from this sort of pernicious grade orientation to a learning orientation, whatever their setting may be, and centering and supporting practitioners in that process. So I think the mission is the same, but we're going to be kind of pivoting toward this new nonprofit status. And I'm working really closely with Susan Bloom, who is the editor of the book on grading. Is helping me with our book and is also going to be helping us with the nonprofit. Also, I want to give a shout out to Chris McNutt of the Human Restoration Project, has been helping us a lot because they're a nonprofit. We're also huge admirers of them as well. So that's what's happening now. It's a very exciting time.
That is so great. Good to hear. And some familiar names there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying this conversation, consider adding the Teachers on Fire YouTube channel to your morning commute. Start your day on fire. And remember, Grow Beyond Grades as well. While you are subscribing to channels and podcasts, make sure you include them. Well, let's start to wind this down, Arthur, with some biographical questions. I'll try to keep my responses exceedingly brief. Outside of education, what's another area of learning for you? What is it that ignites your passions away from professional learning and brings you alive as a human being?
Oh boy, I would say it's primarily my family, because they basically monopolize all the rest of my time is the big part of it. But we do lots of fun things together, and it's been a lot of fun exploring Vermont. So we came here in 2020 during the pandemic. I did my professional development in the parking lot of a McDonald's. And since that point, we have been, summiting small mountains and hiking and just really enjoying our surroundings. So that's been a lot of fun, and that gives me a lot of life.
Share about one personal habit or a productivity hack that contributes to your success and keeps your fire burning. How do you get it all done? Is there some daily practice that you really rely on?
Oh boy. I have a lot of these things. I definitely use a lot of the Google apps for education, if you want to put it that way, to keep myself organized. So I use Google Calendar. Google Calendar is like my brain, basically.
Yeah,
if it's
me
not
too.
in Google Calendar, I will not show up. But if it is in Google Calendar, I'll be there 10 minutes early. So, and I think I do impress a lot of people that I actually do show up for things on a regular basis. And I'm frequently the first one in the room. I turn on the lights and maybe even turn on the computer too. So that's a big one.
Recommend one book that you've been reading lately, or perhaps one of your all-time faves that's been deeply influential in your practice.
Let's see. I read about 5 books at any given time, just like read a chapter and then I go on to the next one. I've really been enjoying Bakhtin, who's a Russian literary theorist who came up with the idea of the dialogic in novel writing, and Dostoevsky as one of the pioneers of this idea. Has a lot of really interesting ideas, many of which have been applied to education. I do find that idea of, I think someone said the dialectic at one point. I think a related concept of the dialogic as opposed to the monologic, which is really what I think assessment, grading, and reporting has been. But I do like to read these sort of like education adjacent theories. I don't read a ton of education books, but I like to read things that kind of like shed a different kind of light on education.
Tell us about one person, Arthur, that we need to follow on Education X, LinkedIn. I'm trying to think. I know you're not on all the social media, so wherever you happen to hang out online, who's been inspiring you, and who do we need to connect with?
I think your brother is going to be one of my follows on LinkedIn. I thought that was a very, he seems like a really interesting, he has a very interesting perspective. Let's see, I don't go hard, I don't go near X hardly any at all. I mean, it's just kind of a dumpster fire from my standpoint. I would say I'm going to give another shout out to Human Restoration Project. I think they do great work. They're in my native Midwest, and it's really fun to see the things that they're up to back there. Also, in my home state of Michigan, they're working with some schools there, so they're always up to quite interesting things, and I'm like alternately admiring and envying them all the time. So,
HRP, Human Restoration Project, and
absolutely.
Last one, Arthur. I'm sorry.
Goals.
Yes.
Yeah. Hashtag goals.
Hashtag goals, absolutely. They have a slick, they do a lot of things well.
Yeah,
just for fun, and the answer to this one, Arthur, might be nothing. But what are you streaming in terms of video entertainment during your downtime right now?
I get on my phone a lot, and I'm not proud of that fact. But I've been getting into like Martin Short's Jiminy Glick. I've been watching these old videos. We were kind of disappeared into this persona for like several years. He didn't do anything else except he was interviewing in the person of Jiminy Glick. And they're just really disturbing interviews, and they're so fun. And he's basically making fun of like modern comedians the entire time. So he has lots of like famous modern comedians on, and he's just basically making fun of that they don't have punchlines. They're really not good on their feet, and it's hilarious.
That's
so it's not streaming really. I don't really get.
Yeah, well, that counts. That counts.
Yeah, it's like old YouTube videos.
That's right. Okay. What are the best ways, Arthur, for those who are interested in your message? Perhaps they've been emboldened by this conversation to start grading less. How can they connect with you?
You gave my information, but you can also find Grow Beyond Grades at GBG EDU.
Okay.
We have a Facebook group, Grow Beyond Grades. We have a LinkedIn page, Grow Beyond Grades. We have a website, growbeyondgrades.org. If you get to one of those spots, you'll find out what we're up to at any given time.
Well, I love the brand change, Arthur, that you unpacked for us from teachers going gradeless to Grow Beyond Grades. It's so positive, and that speaks to your entire vision, everything behind this assessment transition that you are advocating for. So thank you so much for sharing your precious time, your Saturday with the program today. This has been fun and enlightening for me and for my listeners. Teachers on Fire, I'm your host, Tim Cavey, and I'm so grateful that you too decided to spend some of your day listening to this podcast. I hope that in some way the content you heard today from Arthur Chiaravalli sparked your thinking and ignited your practice, and I'll meet you next week right here on the Teachers on Fire podcast. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hustle hard, hustle every single day. I'll be making moves till I'm buried in